All right, folks, we are live. A Moment with Mart, show number 3. Do it with me here real quick. Just blow your air all the way out through your mouth. And then in through the nose. Hold it. Exhale through the mouth. Curious if you lined that up with me or if you're going to have to go back and try to do it all over again. I just did that right before the cameras were on. And so I felt like we'd go off the cuff and just try to do it as a unit. But one of the reasons why that popped into my head to do that as a unit just now is because I was curious as to where our breathing comes from. Why does if you remember from the last one, I talked about with you guys about breathing in general from my last book, Breathe, Focus, Excel, but that's not what I'm talking about. And I'm not talking about my book. I'm curious as to how do I start the movement of an inhalation? And then where is this exhalation going? Now, I would know technically through science that the inhale is bringing in oxygen, right? And I'm going to exchange that oxygen with what's called carbon dioxide, CO2. And when I exhale, I expel CO2 from my lungs. Now, if you dive deep into that, we have what's called alveoli, which is the exchange of where oxygen and CO2 takes place in the lungs. And there's a lot of stuff that you can kind of jump into if you're curious as to how that oxygen from the air outside world gets into our body to fuel us. There's a thing I would look up, the Bohr effect, B-O-H-R, the Bohr effect. But that's a great explanation to how we get oxygen throughout the body and into the muscle tissue. Now, there's a lot of ways that we do that, and we can do that, again, scientifically. We understand the difference between nasal breathing and mouth breathing, and we understand the benefits of nasal breathing over mouth breathing. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the reasons why, if you take a deep breath through your nose and you exhale through the nose, you should feel the movement somewhat around the belly, if you will. If you take a deep breath through your mouth, exhale through the mouth, you should feel somewhat of an upper chest breath, if you will. And so because of gravity, our blood sits at the bottom of the lungs. And so then when we have positions of breathing in through our nose, we are grabbing a lot of that blood exchange, that oxygen dense area of our lungs, which is just filled with parasympathetic tone and relaxing adaptive tone on that nervous system. If you remember what we talked about, it's filled with that down there at the bottom of the lungs because of gravity. And when we move, we can kind of shake that blood up with that oxygen. We can get it into the heart and we can funnel it all throughout the body into the muscle tissue. When we inhale deeply or we breathe fast into our chest, our upper chest, or up in towards our collarbone, typically through our mouth, we don't have much oxygen up here. That's considered more of a sympathetic tone, more of a fight or flight activity. So a hyperventilative state, which is what creates in the way in which our brainstem perceives that. It perceives it as fight or flight activity. Largely, if we do that in a workout, or we're doing it when we're talking, or when we're eating, and we're breathing through our mouth naturally, or needing to do these in these intense, we'll just stick with the intense exercise. When we do it in that framework, that's acute. So it doesn't matter. It's needed, in fact, for our body and our nervous system to get stronger. But when we do it chronically, we start to find dysfunction because we start to underutilize oxygen in the body, and then we start to get bacteria build up. Obviously, we're going to see a disruption in our cells, and we're going to become weaker and sick and dysfunctional in our mind as well. So we're going to become, as I allude to, we're going to have less space in our container to think. That tends to create anxieties and frustrations and moments of concerningness and worry. in the way in which we're perceiving reality. And we don't want any of those things, right? So I'm coming back to my original question and the point of the original breath that we took as a group. But where does it come from? Why is my body pulling in air and letting out air? Why is it wanting to do that? It doesn't on an unconscious level, but we made it conscious to start this. So that means that we have control over what's happening inside of our body. That means that we have control over our blood distribution and our muscle tissue and our oxygen CO2 exchange. And another little fun fact about our breathing through our nose is we have nasal hairs. We can humidify the air. We can warm it up into the lungs. It's kind of a soothing effect for the body when we breathe through our nose. We also, those hairs are beautiful because they stop particles from the air. They disrupt. I mean, think about how much of modern society is polluted with air now in the major cities that we're in, and the repercussions of industrialization and sort of what we've created as air quality. We start to see allergies and colds and dysfunctions in our nasal cavities, which leads us into mouth breathers. But we need those hairs to try to combat a lot of the particles and the polluted air that's around us. We have that filter in our homes, kind of that stale air that happens in where we're inside all the time. So we want to breathe through our nose so that we can filter a lot of that stuff through the nasal cavities. We also produce nitric oxide, which is really cool. It's really just a buffer system to the sinuses, which allows us to dilate our blood vessels. It literally creates what's called vasodilation. It dilates your system. And so when you inhale through the nose and you bring in that good oxygen, there's my deep filtration system, but then I can exchange it with CO2. And when I let it out, my body is at a level of homeostasis, hopefully. And hopefully we can maintain that. Ideally, obviously outside of those events I talked about, talking, eating, working out intensely. When we can breathe through the nose regularly, we should be able to hyper-focus, retain information. We should have bigger containers. We should be able to creatively think. We should be able to solve problems. We should be able to rationalize things. We should be able to connect with the behaviors and the feelings of our emotions, which is different, in my opinion, of our thoughts. There's an energy cycle there. There's a feedback loop from emotions, absolutely. But when we can breathe smoothly and calmly, we have a better chance to sort of build an awareness around emotion. When we can build awareness around emotion, we can allow it to pass through as it needs to, but then we can also let it die. I say that often to people that I work with. When you become aware of something, it can die. But awareness is scary because now you're in tune with it. And that's why so often we want to suppress things. But this still is not getting to the point about why do we breathe and how is it that we know to pull air in? How is our anatomy working for us? And how is our physiology being impacted? And then how are we thinking based off of that physiology? It fascinates me. And I'm curious as to where that's coming from, and then where is it going to? And what is this cycle of movement of air that we keep bringing in and out? And it just keeps going in and out in a flow. And we relate so much of that flow to how we perceive the material world. And I don't know if that's what came to me right before we pressed play. So I just talked about it. But I don't know how that came about when I first started thinking deeply about consciousness and what consciousness really is. I think, a couple of years ago, I can sort of recall the moment that I was consumed with the concept of God and the infinite part of the universe and what the cosmos was and what we were really doing here. I really dove into that a few years ago, not in I'm going to learn this. It was just a curiosity of confusion that I wanted to try to understand, because once again, you sort of have this conscious mind and you have this unconscious mind, but what is consciousness? Because we can explain what conscious is. We can explain what the subconscious is. We can talk about the conscious breathing that you're doing when you consciously inhale through your nose and consciously exhale through your nose, we can clearly feel and experience that, and we can map that out, and we can collect data, and we can bring about very tangible aspects to that. We know that cadence breathing, coherent breathing, that's that pendulum style breathing, that same inhalation, same exhalation out. We know if you can bring that down to 5-6 breaths per minute with the respiratory rate controllably, that you can start to rewire and unwind into that nervous system, which is where you start to see so much of that clear thinking and that awareness to feelings and behaviors within the body. It also enable to do that, you would need to be mechanically sound. You would need to be able to appropriately use your diaphragm to have access to that slow rhythm type pace breathing. You wouldn't be able to do that with minimal diaphragm movement, or poor mechanics, if you will. And it's kind of the same thing. Then we can look at the subconscious, and we know that we dream. We know that we have dreams. We know that we have memories. We know that we are so often stuck in our past thinking. We know that so much of our guilt and our regret and shame comes from our past, but it's not with us. The past, even me talking 10 minutes ago, is no longer real. Now we can record this. We can make this real for myself, my family, my friends to listen to, for you guys to listen to. We can run it back. We can fact check me. We can fact check other things. We can go back in time to things that we posted years ago. And like I said, we can have memories from things that we had experiences of as kids. And so many times we have traumatic experiences as kids and in our development years that we have now created hardcore patterns as adults that we can't break. But they can't be real in this moment, right? So it's a fascinating thing to think about as well, is how did we create a subconsciousness that allows us to live in a past on a regular basis? And then furthermore, if you connect all of consciousness, and we have this unique thing inside of us that allows us to project the future. I don't know what other animals and species are able to do. I definitely believe in plants' consciousness. I think animals have levels of consciousness. I think that clearly they do, because there's a lot of species other than humans who are able to predict weather patterns, and they can change things. I mean, think of birds migrating, and there's the ability for species other than the human that is able to do things based off of future predictions. And for us specifically, with our future predictions, we have the ability to desire something, which warms itself up to become a manifestation of what we visualize in the future, which in the practice of mental skills and sports psychology that's been used since I've been in sports, is the power of sitting down and visualizing. And you see that really often when you see people who talk heavily about they had seen this in their past, that they were already going to do that. When someone hoist up a championship title of some sorts, they're so often they talk about how they had seen that happening. And so what is that? And how do we predict things in the future that essentially align and create and distribute the behaviors in the current moment that allow us to have those things, and we form these habits and these routines and these structures that essentially create that person, and then we go on the journey until we get that. And then it becomes interesting there as well, because materially you can think about this level of achievement. If we get to our futuristic predictions and we get to our futuristic accomplishments, we sort of grab a hold of what's considered this thing called the hedonic treadmill. It's this pleasure gainer, if you will. It's this thing that we feel once we get the manifestations of our visualizations. This is all material, I would say. And this is generally speaking, this isn't this has to happen or this always happens. But in general, when we get to achievement aspects of our lives, at certain checkpoints of our lives, we eventually bottom out. We eventually get back to baseline. You see this a lot with money. And you see you want to attract a certain level of money. And then once you get to that level of money, you felt like that level of money would essentially solve all of your issues. and make you happy. And it certainly does at a certain point. But then all of a sudden you get to the baseline and you eventually want more money. Where at one point, getting the money that you had previously been making or having in the current state was a dream to you. Once again, it comes back to even the same thing I was talking about with the first initial breath we did as a unit. What is that, right? Where does all that come from? How do we have that? And these are all things that could be categorized as something. But that leads me into what I thought about before I got on the show with you guys today. And it's one of the basic principles of metaphysics. And it's that we create something out of nothing. But the question becomes, what is nothing? And if I can, if I may, I would really like to read you guys a part of my book. And I think this is just a brief summary of that question. But today, when you look at the modern use of physics, it's the study of things outside objective measure. So let's think about God. Think about God as the being, making God a metaphysical subject. We perceive God as the source of perfection and give answers to what that is. Since we can't interpret reality similarly, our answers are nothing more than a feeling. Therefore, we often debate our subjective feelings towards the topic of God as truth. If we consider God the ultimate being, we can only study what we believe God is. We cannot know God. So if we can put that in the subject of nothing, what is the state of nothing? If I can tell you what inhalation, exhalation is, if I can tell you what the science of nasal breathing versus mouth breathing is, if I can tell you what the conscious and subconscious is, and we can collect that data through science and research and put it into literature for us to better understand ourselves and better understand humanity materially or tangibly, there still is the search for everlasting truth, which is that the great paradox to nothing. Are we on the search to nothingness? And did we come from nothing and are we on our way back to nothing? Clearly, I don't know the answers to these. That's the reason why I asked the question. I think that for me, when I came to grips with that question 2-3 years ago, I was in a much better place with that question because, about a decade ago, I had a really hard stint with nihilism, when you're nihilistic, you essentially perceive everything in the world as being meaningless. And from personal experience, it's not a fun place to be. I think that it definitely sparks some beautiful thinking. And I think that if you can go touch nihilism for a second and sort of consider the meaningless of reality, I think that there's a lot of advantageous thoughts that stem from that. But I don't think living in a place of nihilism becomes healthy or beneficial. Again, that's my opinion. But when you consider everything as meaningless, and the duality to meaningless would be everything is meaningful. And so how can I exist in reality with meaning and purpose and be having desires towards achievements and reaching these sort of goals and predicting the future and manifesting parts of me that I want, understanding the energetic flow of my feelings and my emotions, having an awareness to my behaviors, being able to not analyze those, because I don't think we want to overanalyze our emotions. How do I analyze and rationalize, logically look through things in real time so that I can solve those problems in front of me that get me to the next checkpoint of me materially? And that sort of becomes the path. I used to think of a lot as how do I climb the mountain and then I am there, right? And I think that's the hedonic treadmill trap. I think that we so naturally, largely egotistically, and we're connected with that mind state, we so naturally climb a mountain to get to the peak of that mountain, and we believe that will be the answer, right? It's kind of the same thing in which we put all our trust and our thoughts into things like science or tangibleness or objective data. There's nothing wrong with any of this. It's just that we have yet to get to ultimate truth, actuality, if you will, right? And so it's the same thing in our own lives. We want to accomplish something so that it can alleviate, but in a lot of times, especially as we evolve growing up, as when we're younger, is we want to just eliminate all suffering. And so certain checkpoints, certain goals, they appease to the ego because they give our ego the state of belief and, like I said, eliminating the pain. And so what becomes worse is when we get to those checkpoints and we get to the top of our mountains. Let's just call these the outcomes of goals. And we get to those states. Eventually those things bottom out and you create a baseline and you have to climb another mountain. And that can become really exhausting to sort of just be picking and choosing multiple mountains to climb. I've found in recent years that I think it's more so just one big mountain of suffering, and we just walk up that mountain. And obviously you have the metaphorical states of falling and the stories of not moving and being frozen and really getting up the mountain fast. And sure, I think that all belongs to the human experience, absolutely. But I think the experiences of our mind and body vehicle is to just go up the mountain. And I think that it's to experience and explore all these things of somethingness, all of these tangiblenesses that we play with, that if we can stay aligned with who we ultimately are, we can still hold our levels of nothingness. And I think that nihilistic point can now be flipped, and you can see the meaninglessness of the mountain because you know that there are no checkpoints. So it does become meaningless. It does become meaningless to try to achieve anything. But the exploratory, we'll call it the exploration phase of going up this mountain through curiosity and the openness to sort of figure something out and getting closer to that actuality or that truth, if you will. I think that's where it becomes really meaningful. And so I think we need nothing to have something. And I think that's where that aspect comes in, even in my part of the book. Because I wrote that and I still don't know really what it means. I read my book sometimes back to me, or I read my journal entries, or I even read things that I write that I'll share in workshops or seminars and whatnot. And sometimes it's confusing on me because when you write, and if you guys write, you know what I'm talking about by this. A lot of times when you write, and we'll call it flow state, just to all have common ground. I think when you find a common ground flow state in writing, you don't really know where it comes from. It's like something's working through you. And so when you read it back, it's almost like you were writing to yourself, like you needed to read the message. At least I've found that a lot. And so even when I think to this part that I said in this, we can't interpret reality similarly. So our answers are nothing more than a feeling. I've always found that really fascinating because our concepts of nothing have to be different if we can't interpret reality similarly. But I think that we make our something similar so that we can all structure everything out and play together. And that's a lot of what I think when we have jobs, because we tackle jobs and we create resumes or job descriptions because that's something. And if you don't uphold that something, that materialism side of it, then there's repercussions. And if we didn't have something, if we were just all in nothingness, if we were all just meaningless, nihilistic, if you will, then there'd be no point to have moral compasses or codes or directions. And we certainly need that. But I think the philosophical pursuit of understanding nothingness and how we create something out of nothing, and understanding the duality of the two, just like I said, the basic principle of metaphysics, I think that allows us to see the illusion with meaning, and we can sort of play our characters in a fulfilling sensation of we're climbing our own mountain. We interpret this whole illusion differently than everybody else. And we can have respect while you climb your mountain and while I'm climbing mine. And both of our responsibilities are to climb these things together and to help everybody just get through the thing. while struggling with meaning. But I actually think that all stems from meaninglessness and the oddness of nothingness. And so to kind of wrap that all up with breathing and consciousness, we can't know where breathing comes from. We don't know why this thing moves within us. I don't know what that would be called. I wouldn't know how to define that. I think that we do our best to try to teach breathing, try to help people get closer. But at the end of the day, there is just this flowing cycle of air that's going in and out of my body, and it's keeping me alive. And I don't know how that's happening, where that's coming from, what the point of that is, but there's vitality and there's meaningfulness inside of that. And I think that's why we connect so deeply when we do align with the breathing, and the body follows suit and the mind follows suit, because then you have a full connection of your material side, your body, your mind vehicle, and your soul. And that all sort of aligns together as one. And that's got to go deeper than what consciousness in which we can understand is. I think that's when you start to find the limitlessness, the infiniteness of existence. And that becomes really fascinating to me on breathing. So like I told you on the last one that we were talking about, we have a question today. And I ran long. As I know on the last one, I know that I ran long. I apologize for that. Sometimes I get going. I hope that I never go over an hour. I don't want to ever promise that, but I'll try to stay underneath that. But as I said on the last one, so we had a question. I apologize for clearing my throat as well often too, but this dry desert air gets me. Question of the first question. I was already going to start reading the second question that's coming up for the next show. But the question from the last show that we were preparing for this one was from Brian Ferrati, who is a cool dude he's in Oregon, I believe, but I think he's in Japan currently right now. He's a really cool guy. He's got a podcast out. He writes a newsletter. He's a coach, a trainer. He does a lot of things. He's just a really curious dude, and he's a really easy guy to have a conversation with. He sent this question in: how do you get clear on what it is you truly want in who you want to become? So how do you get clear on what it is you truly want? Let's start there, and then we can finish with in who you want to become. Well, I think that aligns great with what we're talking about in terms of nothingness and somethingness. Because how do we get clear on what it is we truly want? I think that there's it's an edgy concept of what we want, because wanting things egotistically, I think, very easily runs us into that hedonic treadmill. It puts us into the mountain tops where we get to the tops of mountains. And this needs to be had in the state of becoming, because if we didn't have goals and have outcomes and have structure, as I already said, if we didn't have that in terms of the working force, then how would we communicate and morally decide what's a good code of conduct to keep us allowing to play together appropriately? It's the same thing with the book in front of me. I had deadlines on these books. All the books this book Without Words was the first book that I wrote. The last book I got published before I wrote the book. So I had legitimate deadlines that I had to accomplish. I got published about halfway through with this last book, and then I received my deadlines. But the books I've written before these books that were never published, they were no deadlines, and they all died. And things always came up ahead of time, and they won out. So why I say that is because to get clear on what you truly want, I think you do have to set goals. And you do need to quantify your work and objectify it through the result of good and bad. And I think sports is so beautiful for this, because, I grew up in all sports, but highlighting baseball specifically, when I grew up playing baseball, after every game, you knew that you did good or bad. Even if you hit the ball hard 4 times, I've never met a baseball player who went 0 for 4 and was happy. And even though a coach or parent or a friend will say you barreled the ball up really good and you had 4 really good at bats. You just got unlucky. It doesn't matter to the performer. The performer knows the performance is perceived as bad in the box score and in the statistics. So it still bothers you. And I don't know if we can get over that. I think that that's just how we're wired egotistically. The mind it analyzes everything. And that's where we put statistics in front of the performers, because then we can create and quantify their levels of performance. If you're getting this in the business side, sports specific, professionally, well, that measures how much money you can get paid. I think that's the same reason why an investor will ask you as a business owner, an entrepreneur, to show you your numbers, your P&Ls, and show how your business does year after year and how you plan to generate more income, because they're going to give you a tangible monetary piece of money. If they're going to give you something real, there's going to be a transaction there, and they need to know they're going to get a return on their investment. And even though you're taking a gamble and there's a risk, you're trying to mitigate risk. So clearly everything needs to be measurable and there needs to be outcomes. And so I think life is these miniature mountaintops of finding what we want. And I would suggest, and I really don't like suggesting anything, but what I've suggested to myself and what I'm grateful that I suggested to my younger self, even though this is rather scary, I would try everything. And I think a lot of the hard truths that I had when I got released from sports is that when you're playing sports as a youngster and you make it all the way up professionally, you give so many resources to that endeavor. So you commit all in to be there, which is largely what mastery takes. You need to be all about your sport. You see that a lot with these guys who have made it to the big leagues for many years, or in the NHL, or Olympians specifically. My gosh, look at Olympians. I mean, they give up everything for 4 years for maybe a 10-second sprint. That is an incredible thing. I'm grateful for the events and the atmospheres I've had with Olympians in the past. I hope I get to have many more in the future. But working with Olympians is I have such deep compassion for their pursuits, because they have such a small window in which they entirely go all the way in. But I think that one of the things that I learned about myself when I got out of playing at the age of 25, I was basically 26, a month before my 26th birthday, I had realized how many things I had not done in my life, and how many things I had not explored, and things that I did not find intriguing or unique to me. And I don't discredit the sport to that, because I think that that's what it takes to try to make it. But I largely think that when you get into somewhat of a cocoon of thinking, because you don't expand yourself through curiosities or trying things, then you short side your vision, your perspective, and you don't ever really get to see what you truly want. I think that you just naturally identify with your sport in this specific example. And I think that's one of the reasons why Olympians have such a hard time when the Olympics are done, because they've given everything to that character. And so to go play something else, how would they know what they truly want? Is that even possible? Because whether it was accurate or not, they'd given up all mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual resources to being the opportunity of being a gold medalist in an Olympic sport. So if I could answer that broadly and answer that to a young kid or adults, even, or just anybody, I would say to try all things, and I think when you're a kid, specifically in young childhood, you do try so many things. I think naturally the education system is largely what starts to create conformity, and it largely standardizes you through tests and classes and homework, and it kind of tells you what you're going to learn, and it's preparing you for the assembly line after school. And it's going to send you to colleges for specific things. And if you can't acquire that, you need to get a trade and you need to move into the working force. I think that's slow. That's maybe quickly, but I think that that's definitely dying. But I think that that's been a large background of the building of consciousness, the building blocks of consciousness for sure, and how we've been over the last couple hundred years. And there's a really cool aspect in diving into the education systems that came out of Germany in the 17th century, and how that they were kind of building military workers and factory workers through, I think it was age 7 to 14 is what they were figuring out then, which is still largely exists. But I think that was the ages that they realized how important it was to mold a mind, right? And we mimicked a lot of that stuff in the 19th century and brought that over here. And we mimicked a lot of those systems for the factory working and the assembly line of America, because we did the same thing. We came over here and industrialized the country, did a lot of things through the railroads to be expand through the land and be able to get ourselves out west and, all throughout areas in America. But we did sort of the same thing. And so how do you get clearer on what it is you truly want? I think you have to hold two sides to this. I think you need to know that you'll never know, but you're worth pursuing the things that you're willing to try and find out what it is. I think it becomes a way of being in the world. You sort of are on this natural pursuit. And there's your last question to it. Who you want to become? You're on this normal, natural pursuit of becoming ultimately yourself. And I think that do you ever get to that and you get to put a period at the end of it and say, this is me, period? I don't know if that's true. I think that that's the point of climbing the mountain. I think that on the way to climbing the mountain, you're finding out who you're becoming, and you're becoming ultimately, ideally, you're becoming more of who you are, which back to my book, I call that Without Words, because of that pursuit. But I think on how you get clearer on what you truly want on that straight mountain climb up north all the way to the top, you are having these mini mountains, these hills, these mountains, these valleys, these peaks, and you're experiencing all of the illusion by trying and attempting things. And there was a guy, a mentor of mine years ago when I first started a business. He had really cool advice that I've carried with me for many years now, not just in building a business, but in how I've thought about most endeavors. He told me, when you're running a business, that if something's not working, you need to kill it early. You need to kill it fast, because you don't have time to waste, specifically when you're starting the building blocks of the foundation of a company. You need to kill it fast. But he also meant to try something fast. So you need to see what works in the market, and if it's not working, you need to kill it. And as I even say that out loud, I can tell a short story to that, because I got into the market of saunas, mobile saunas, in 2017. I really thought that was going to be something that would hit. And we spent that year building one, and I believe we had it prepped and ready for early 2018. And whether I was bad at marketing or advertising or selling, or just not really in store to run a business or equipped at that time, that business didn't work. And it was really hard to get anybody to be in a mobile sauna in 2017, 2018. There wasn't a lot of demand. This was pre-COVID era. And we weren't in the homes just yet. We didn't have the pandemic. We weren't, there weren't episodes like Huberman, and Joe Rogan wasn't blasting I think the Joe Rogan Huberman, from my perspective, was large for that industry, but it hadn't come out yet. And there wasn't as much mass media and marketing and advertisements. There were no competitors. We had no competitors in Minneapolis. We couldn't find anybody really. And there were some people doing certain things, but we couldn't find anybody socially that was even able to base something off. And like I said, it was starting. And when COVID hit, I had chose to change gears and go a different route. I chose performance coaching and more of a consulting avenue. And there were some friends of mine who kept with the mobile sauna business and ended up having a ton of success. And now going into 2025, you can find mobile sauna businesses all around the country. And so when the time was right, was it right? But I also have learned in 2025 that my pursuit wasn't to be a mobile sauna meister. I love saunas. I have deep respect for the traditions of wood burning, specifically saunas. I mean, I went to Finland a couple of years ago to study saunas. I love saunas, and I use them in practices. But was that my thing, right? Was that clearly what I wanted to be doing? I think the answer to that is no in the current moment. But I tried and I went after it. And I think that's a short story on how you get clear on what it is you truly want. And I think where it gets dangerous is when you've been in something for a significant amount of time and you don't want it. It feels somewhat of an imprisonment. and you feel confined and you can't get out of it. And I think that's where it gets really scary. And I think you need to budget for certain humanistic sides of things where people have children, people have to make money for tons of things. Maybe it's college debt, maybe it's a family member, maybe they've whatever. There's tons of reasons why people have to have jobs and pay the bills and do those things all the time. I've had to do that myself. But I think you get caught. That's one of the ways that you get trapped and you get caught. And I also think that's harder on finding out what it is you truly want. So I think we know if we spend enough time with our intuition what it is, but I think you have to take a lot of punches throughout your whole life. And like I said, you got to climb a bunch of little mountains and little hills and foothills to figure out this is what you are, and this is getting me closer to who I am, and this is clearly not who I am, and this is clearly not what I want. And when you have scenarios where it's clearly not something you want, I just would, again, I'll suggest to myself, if you want to take a suggestion to myself as a suggestion to you, go for it, but I would kill it fast and I would move forward. You know, I wanted to be a strength and conditioning coach right when I was done playing professional baseball. It was my first thing. I got certified in that. I was teaching classes at Minnesota State. I really thought I wanted to do that. And I ran out of that passion quick. And I knew I didn't want to do that long term. And I'm really grateful that I didn't do it. I was almost a college pitching coach. I had a few offers to be a college pitching coach. I had opportunities to be a major league scout full time. I did that part time for a long time. And then I had the ability to kind of get into the pro ranks and coaching. And I just knew that being a pitching coach was never going to be my thing. I knew that being a scout and taking the route towards player development wasn't really my thing. And I think that those can all blend in their own unique way. But I think when you know it's not your thing, and you got to get out of it. And I know that becomes scary, and you get into the unknown and it gets rather scary. But I also think that leads me into the back end of your question of who you want to become, because how do you find out who you ultimately are becoming? Not necessarily who you are with period. Who are you becoming with comma, we'll say, so that it's ongoing. You have to throw yourself into unknowns. Now, the unknowns need to be thrown into your world in levels in which you can hold. And that's why I mentioned the job. I don't think it's the most beneficial thing ever if you have family and responsibilities and children or college debt that you just go for your dream job and start at nothing and you just live in debt, because I think the anxiety and the overwhelmingness of that will disrupt your ability to think appropriately and solve problems. I think that you have to, again, like I said, make the little mountains, make the little desirable points and the little checkpoints, and you got to climb yourself out of these holes if you need to. It obviously helps to start earlier. The earlier you start, the better. But I'm here 35 years old and I'm restarting my podcast, and I feel refreshed with ideas, a new person, a new perspective. And I'm way more excited now to sort of sustain this professionally as a career than I was when I was 25, when I first started getting after this. I had great times and great fun then, but I do think that I'm a different me now. And I think that I've become something else, and I'm still on that large scale mountain, but I had to climb a lot of little mountains to get to this. So I don't know. I think maybe that helps. How do you get clear on what it is you truly want and who you want to become? I think it's an unanswerable question, but I think if I could sum it up in one sentence, I think you break it down. You try as many things as you feel curious and pulled to. If it doesn't sustain you, you kill it and you move on to the next. You set objective, short-term goals, 3 months, 6 month, 12-month goals, and you climb those mountains and you reflect heavily when you get to the top of those mountains on, is that getting you closer to who you are, or was that materially driven? Is the ego want something? And I think we find that. I think that's the path to wisdom. And I think that as we know, if we can do that for a lifetime while also realizing that we will never get to what we truly want, because I don't know if we get to know that. I think that we just try to become more of who we are, more authentic, more original, more unique. And that happens all through our own experiences. Because like I said, we don't interpret this experience the same. So becoming who we want becomes a lonely pursuit. And that is already an unknown. And that would be my final suggestion, again, to myself, if you want to take it, is why would you avoid the unknown I think you got to handle the unknown and to the degree that you can, as I already stated. But why would you avoid that? Because that's almost like a discredit to your soul to do that. And it's a very cowardice move to just form yourself in certainty and avoid change and avoid struggle. And so I think that by naturally doing that, there's things that get pulled out of your consciousness from nothing. Here you go, that you can ultimately turn into something. And maybe that's the fireworks of the show with A Moment with Mart today. So the question coming up next for the next show is going to be from my very good friend, Tom Buski. Tom Buski, I'll talk more about him on the next one, and I hope I have him on here someday. I had him on one time back in the day when I was doing this, and the podcast gear was so old that it fried out. And he was good. I think he was the last guy I ever tried to podcast in 2022, maybe. And it was great. It was going to be a lot of fun. And I was nervous to interview him, actually. But I've known Tom for many years. He's one of the kindest. He's a great businessman, but he's very kind. He's very loyal. He's a lot of fun to be around. And his question for the next show is, what would the world be like if humans lived twice as long? So I'm more curious as to what headspace he was in when he asked that question. But I'll take a crack at it next show, and I look forward to jumping back on with you guys. Again, just a little finisher here. We'll have some guests coming up alongside it. These guests are going to be coming in and out. So, I know that I'm going to keep Schmaltzy. Schmaltzy keeps that leadoff spot, but I had my neighbor come in who I just met recently because we just moved into a spot, Lance Kaufman, and he wrote a book, Eyes of Sedona, and he's more into anthropology and has done a lot of stuff. His background's in physics, and he came over today and just to drop off some muffins. We had never hung out before, just more so passing each other on the streets and on the roads and the trails, saying hello during walks. But he came in today and we just sat down. We were talking about aliens and life forms and history and how rock formations happen. And so I couldn't help it. I had to ask Lance to come on the show. We exchanged books. It makes me feel a lot cooler now that I know who my neighbor is even more. So maybe that's another lesson of the show. Go meet your neighbors, talk to them, get to know them. But I look forward to having Lance on here. I've got another lineup coming in. I don't know when he's going to air, but I'm excited to have him on this, and I'm excited to keep bringing you guys some really interesting people. I think you guys are going to really enjoy a lot of the folks that I bring on here. As for me, I'm signing off for the evening. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and let me know your thoughts. Let me know, as always, give me feedback on what you think nothing is, and how you think we create something, how you've created something out of nothing. And if you want, let's take one more breath together. Fully in. Let it out. Where does that come from? Where does that come from? Cheers.